Another review for, in this case, Chapter 14, Simple as Possible, AMP. Chapter 14 deals with the spinal cord, so here's the big and the basic kind of stuff. Here's the brain. Brain sitting on top of the spinal cord. Spinal cord is approximately 18 inches, 1 cubit long. It goes from the medulla down to about L2. So from about the foramen magnum of the occipital bone, cranial bone, down to about lumbar vertebrae number 2. The end of the spinal cord is rounded. It's called the Conus Medullaris. Again, note it does not go all the way down your back. It stops around L2. This thing right here reminds me to remind you that the brain is protected by the cranium, a sort of a helmet of bones right there. The opening in the cranium is going to be the foramen magnum of the occipital bone. Then the spinal cord goes down through the vertebrae, the vertebral foramen of each one of the vertebrae, and down towards, but never getting to, the sacrum. Remember, it stops around L2 at the conus medullaris, but the meninges go beyond the conus medullaris. And so therefore the filum terminale right here is an extension of the pia mater that goes all the way down towards the sacral bone and the coccyx bone. To the sides, the pia mater seems to be pulled out a little bit, and these little lateral extensions are called denticulate ligaments. Denticulate means teeth, and ligaments because it's connecting to a bone. And it tends to stabilize it laterally, whereas this thing tends to stabilize it vertically. Back over here, here's the conus medullaris. Again, the pia mater is going to come all the way down here as the filum terminale. The arachnoid also pulls down, and it creates a pocket right here of the subarachnoid space. And this pocket right here is a very convenient place to get a sample of cerebral spinal fluid. So yeah, that's a syringe. So somewhere between L3, L4, L4, L5 is where you could carefully insert a syringe, do the equivalent of what's called a spinal tap or lumbar puncture, and take a sample of cerebral spinal fluid. Of course, realizing that when you do that, there's now less cerebral spinal fluid that floats, coats, and bloats the brain, and so therefore you need to have some kind of time for the patient to, well, create some more cerebral spinal fluid in here. So can't jump up immediately after something like that. Again, so boom, big stuff right here. And now, looking at the spinal cord, it's divided into basically 5 different regions: the cervical region, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. These are associated with the spinal nerve pairs that come away from this, and there are 8 spinal nerves pairs that are called cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 that's coccygeal, so a total of 31 spinal nerve pairs. In basic, very basic terms, yeah, they're coming off of the spinal cord, cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral. Most of these nerves right here are mixed. They're carrying both sensory and motor information. Again, I think they all are mixed. And down the bottom where the conus medullaris is, well, the last lumbars, all the sacrals and the coccygeal have to exit the spinal cord and move down the vertebral column to then exit from the bone that they're associated with. Now, this bundle right here of spinal nerves that aren't paralleling the spinal cord are called the cauda equina, or sort of like the ponytail. And so they move down and then they move out into the body from the bone that they're associated with, the sacrals, the lumbars, and the coccygeal. In a spinal tap, the reason why it's relatively safe to do a puncture down here is because the solid spinal cord is up here around L2, and down here there are structures, but these are more movable structures. So therefore a needle could be carefully inserted between these more movable structures. That's damage. Next thing right here, there are 2 general enlargements in the spinal cord, and that's the cervical enlargement and the lumbosacral enlargement. This is where there's a little bit more gray matter in the spinal cord, and some might say it's the equivalent of a coordination center. This one right here involved in coordinating the movements of the arms, as in a normal swing of the arms when you walk, and down here coordinating the legs as in a normal swing of the legs when you're walking. Looking at this thing right here, we have the spinal cord, and in the back there's a shallow groove called the posterior median sulcus. In the front there's a deep groove called the anterior median fissure. And in essence, it divides it into right and left halves. Over here, we're looking at spinal cord. Here's a cutaway. Here's the anterior median fissure. Immediately on the surface of the spinal cord, there is the first of the meninges, the pia mater. Above that is the subarachnoid space where the cerebral spinal fluid is going in that direction. Sorry about that. It's going up in that direction right there. Then there is the arachnoid. Now the arachnoid is a membrane, but it has spider-like extensions that move down towards the pia mater, and that creates the webbed space called the subarachnoid space where the cerebral spinal fluid is moving up towards the top of the brain. Now, above the arachnoid is something called the subdural space. Then there's the dura mater, and above the dura mater, there's the epidural space. So to keep straight, the meninges, just remember PAD, pia mater, arachnoid, and dura mater, and these potential spaces, epidural, subdural, and this always open space here, the subarachnoid space. That's the way it is around the spinal cord. Around the brain, a little more complicated. There's the pia mater, the subarachnoid space, the arachnoid, or arachnoid mater. Here is the dura mater, but there's two levels or two layers to the dura mater. There's the meningeal layer and the periosteal layer. The periosteal layer is up against the cranial bone. Looking inside a cross-section of the spinal cord. Up in the cervical region, there's a very distinctive H shape. Of course, you got to be kind of creative to see the thing, but there's a shape that is H-shape if you really think about it. Give it a little imaginary push. The gray matter, also known as gray horns right there. Again, one side mirrors the other side, and there's a bridge between the two called the gray commissure. There is white matter where there isn't gray matter, and these are also known as columns, and they're made up of tracks, that is ascending and descending tracks, fibers, axons, moving material up and down. So in the cervical region, C1 down to C7, it's as simple as this. But down in the thoracic region, down into the lumbar region, the H shape has a little extra something to it. Little saddlebags on the sides right here. So normally we would talk about a posterior or dorsal horn, an anterior or ventral horn, and that's it right here. But here we can talk about a posterior or dorsal horn, a lateral horn, and then an anterior or ventral horn. So this is the inclusion that shows up from T1 down to L2. Again, more gray matter. Looking at the arrangement of that gray matter, the back here is called the posterior horn or dorsal horn. The side is the lateral horn. The front is the anterior or the ventral horn. The gray commissure, again, bridges between the right and the left. And there is a tube there in the middle filled with cerebral spinal fluid, and that's the central canal. Now, the white matter is described as being columns. So here's the posterior column, here are the lateral columns, and here are the anterior columns. The columns are also sometimes called funiculi, and sections, subdivisions of that would be called fasciculi. So funiculi or funiculus for the big column, and then within that, bundles, tracks called fasciculi. Funiculi refers to threads. Fasciculus, you might remember, refers to bundles, as in a fascicle and such, or superficial fascia. Right, and again, there's the anterior median fissure, there's the posterior median sulcus as landmarks. If we look real carefully at the gray matter, this gray matter right here, we would see that coming in from the dorsal root is sensory information. In fact, here are some unipolar neurons kind of emphasizing the fact that this is sensory information coming in. Some of that sensory information is called somatic sensory, and it has to do with body position. So things you're more conscious of, body position. Then you also have visceral sensory, and that's more internal, interoceptors, communications from, say, pressoreceptors in stomach wall, or thermoreceptors, or you get what? Chemoreceptors, say, inside the aorta or something to that effect. Anyway, so this is sort of subconscious information. This is potentially more conscious information. Now, The somatic sensory information comes in, synapses from this unipolar neuron with this multipolar neuron, which can then send a signal to a somatic motor neuron, which could then send a signal out through the ventral or anterior root. So out to the body, information going that way. Or it could branch over and perhaps share that information with some other neurons on the other side of the spinal cord, or perhaps eventually send it up towards the brain. By the way, if the information is shared on the same side of the body as it came in, that's called ipsilateral. If it goes to the opposite side of the body, that's called contralateral. And you might remember that in decussation, contralateral is the idea of things crossing over to the other side. Back to here. Here's visceral information coming in from internal organs and such, not less conscious material. This thing is going to synapse with a multipolar neuron. That multipolar neuron can then synapse with another motor neuron, and this happens over in the lateral horn over here. The autonomic motor can now send a signal out to the body, or it can also send it elsewhere, sharing it up with the brain and such. So remember, we've got input with a sensory, usually unipolar. Here is a connection to an association neuron, which is multipolar, and then it can send that information off to other association neurons, or perhaps directly over to motor neurons, which themselves are multipolar. Notice that the cell body of these association neurons and these motor neurons are inside the gray matter, whereas the cell bodies of these unipolar or sensory neurons were outside of the spinal cord. In fact, they were there inside the dorsal root ganglion. Looking more closely at the distribution of information and the horns, again, somatic sensory came in the posterior and synapsed in the posterior horn. Somatic motor came out of the anterior horn. And both of those potentially are conscious, things that you would be aware of. The visceral sensory and the autonomic motor both synapse inside the lateral horn. And the lateral horn, again, is where the subconscious processing is being taken care of. And that includes cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, exocrine and endocrine glands. So signals coming from and going to these effectors right here. Something else in big, broad, general terms, here is the general pattern, very general pattern, of where sensory information is going up towards the brain and motor information is coming down from the brain. Sensory is out back to the outer edges and towards the back. Motor is in front, basically towards the anterior part of the spinal cord and towards the middle. Now, this is not absolute, that's just a generality. Some more generalities right here. Talking about, again, the spinal nerves. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and they include 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, 1 coccygeal. However, when the cervicals, lumbar, sacrals, and the coccygeals come off, they may braid together, and there are 4 plexes that they might be associated with. So there's a cervical plexus, a brachial plexus, lumbar plexus, and sacral plexus. And of course, it's on the right and left side. This picture right here reminds me to remind you that, yeah, there's a vertebral foramen behind the body of the vertebrae, and it protects the spinal cord. And then between the vertebrae, there's intervertebral foramen, where the spinal nerves can move away. Right here is the big and general pattern that you learned in lab. Again, the posterior dorsal root comes in the back. It's carrying sensory information. Here's the posterior dorsal root ganglion, where you would find the unipolar neuron cell bodies. So there would be gray matter right there. So sensory information comes in the back. Motor information comes out the front in the anterior or ventral root. Over here, the spinal nerve, when the 2 roots are combined, makes up the spinal nerve, and there is a posterior dorsal ramus that goes to the back, and then an anterior ventral ramus that wraps around to the front. The dorsal ramus only has to go like 1-2 inches before it is right there. It's gone all the way through the back, but the ventral ramus has to wrap all the way around to the front of the trunk. So this one is by far the bigger of the 2. Also right here is a strange kind of junction in which information passes from the spinal nerve over to sympathetic ganglia. Now, the sympathetic ganglia are found on either side of the spinal cord. They're called paravertebral sympathetic ganglion. And again, information moves in, information moves out, but it can also move up and down. So it's sort of like an intersection in which information can be skewed up and down parallel to the spinal cord. These little branches right here are called rami communicantes, or cantes. All right, okay, over here, big and simple stuff. When it comes around to feeling the effect of spinal nerve damage on the surface of the body, there's regions called dermatomes. Derm means skin, tome refers to cut or section. And the body can be divided into dermatomes. Each dermatome it parallels the innervation and sensation of each one of the spinal nerves. They are not absolute. They do blend over each other, but it's very, very useful, particularly if you're, say, in chiropractic, to find out where a person's skin may be less than sensitive, may be kind of dull. That might imply that that particular spinal nerve associated with that dermatome is perhaps pinched or something's happening to it. Anyway, so dermatomes are an unusual pattern in which the spinal nerves innervate sections of the skin. Referred pain. Well, referred pain implies that you are strangely wired. And so, for example, nociceptors in your heart might refer pain through your brain over to your left arm. In fact, the little finger side of your left arm. It's not particularly logical in any kind of way, but that's just the way it is. And so therefore, when a person has a tingling sensation in their left little finger or underneath their jaw, it might be one of the first signs of a heart attack. So that's referred pain. It isn't directly over the organ in the body, but it's referred from that organ. Another strange example of that would be your gallbladder. If you're having gallbladder problems, sometimes the pain is referred to your right shoulder. Little words right here just to catch things up. Phrenic, intercostal, and sciatic. Phrenic nerve is the one that is responsible for innervating your diaphragm, so it's a major respiratory muscle and important. Intercostal goes to the external and internal intercostal muscles, which are also part of your respiratory muscles. And then sciatic is that large nerve that goes down the back of your thigh, down your leg. Over here, last thing is say something ever so quickly about reflex arc. We have monosynaptic and we have polysynaptic. Sorry, this thing disappeared here. Monosynaptic. In monosynaptic, you have one receptor and you have one motor. So one sensory and one motor. So there's a receptor on a unipolar neuron that picks up a signal, sends it over to a motor neuron, which sends a signal to an effector. The simplest possible communication. With polysynaptic, there has to be at least three. So there'll be a sensory neuron with a receptor that recognizes the change in the environment. It sends it to an association neuron, which can then send it over to a motor neuron and or to other association neurons. So a monosynaptic reflex only has two neurons in it, one synapse. A polysynaptic reflex must have at least three neurons and at least two synapses.